Rome believed absolute power came from fear, and nowhere was that belief more visible than inside the gladiator school of Capua, a place designed not just to train fighters but to erase men. The school stood behind high stone walls stained by years of sweat and blood, its corridors echoing with the clang of chains and the dull thud of bodies hitting the sand. Here, men were stripped of names, histories, and futures, reduced to living weapons owned by their masters. Among them was Spartacus, a Thracian by birth, a former auxiliary soldier who had once marched under Rome's banners before being betrayed by the very empire he served. Now he stood barefoot on cold stone floors, scars crossing his back like a map of Rome's cruelty, forced to train for spectacles where survival meant killing another man for the roar of a crowd that would forget him the moment the sand was raked clean. Each morning began before dawn, with guards dragging open cell doors and shouting orders while iron collars clinked against skin. Wooden swords cracked against shields again and again, overseers barking commands while watching for weakness, because weakness was punished immediately. Food was measured just enough to keep bodies alive, never enough to keep spirits strong. The air smelled of dust, old blood, and fear that had soaked into the walls so deeply it could never be washed away. Rome believed this place broke men, that suffering would grind them down into obedient tools, but suffering also sharpened the mind. Spartacus watched everything, the shift changes of the guards, the careless habits of men who believed slaves could never organize, the routes through the kitchens where blades were kept close at hand. At night, when the torches dimmed and the school fell quiet, the real training began. Whispers passed from cell to cell, carried through cracks in stone and moments stolen between patrols. 70 men listened and spoke in fragments, Gauls with hatred burning in their eyes, Germans hardened by loss, Thracians who remembered open skies and freedom. They did not speak of glory or revenge at first. They spoke of breathing without permission, of walking without chains, of dying as men instead of entertainment. Spartacus did not shout or command. He listened, measured, and slowly became the center around which their anger gathered. He understood Rome because he had fought for it, and that knowledge made him dangerous. He knew Roman discipline relied on predictability, on the belief that fear alone could maintain order. The guards laughed, gambled, drank, and underestimated the men they owned, never imagining that those same men were counting steps, memorizing keys, and planning with the patience of hunters. The idea of escape seemed impossible even to some of the gladiators themselves, because Rome had designed the school to make hope feel foolish. But desperation is a powerful teacher. When a rumor spread that several of them were to be sold or executed, time collapsed into urgency. The plan formed not as a grand rebellion, but as a simple decision: act now or die slowly. Kitchen knives became swords in their minds, courage replaced armor, and fear turned into focus. On the chosen night, the silence felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. When the first guard fell, it happened fast, almost quietly, blood spilling across stone that had seen worse. There was no turning back after that. 70 men moved through the school like a storm released from captivity, striking with speed born of desperation, seizing real weapons from the armory that had once symbolized their fate. Gates that had never been meant to open from the inside gave way under force and will. As they ran into the darkness beyond Capua, barefoot and armed, the weight of Rome's certainty cracked for the first time. The Republic did not yet know it, but in that moment, inside a gladiator school it believed was secure, the greatest slave revolt in its history had already begun. Mount Vesuvius rose above the fertile plains of Campania like a silent witness, its slopes green and peaceful, hiding the violence that was about to erupt from its shadow. To Rome, it was nothing more than a sleeping mountain, a natural trap where a group of escaped gladiators could be cornered and crushed at leisure. To Spartacus and the men who followed him, it became something else entirely, a place where fear loosened its grip and possibility began to breathe. From the heights, they could see Roman roads threading through the countryside, villas dotting the land like prizes of excess, and fields worked by slaves who lifted their heads in disbelief at the sight of armed men who had broken their chains. The fugitives were still few, exhausted, and hunted, but the mountain gave them time, and time gave them clarity. Rome sent a small force to contain them, confident that hunger and isolation would finish the job. The soldiers camped at the only obvious path down, laughing at the idea that untrained slaves could challenge Roman discipline. What Rome did not understand was that these men were not untrained, and they were no longer thinking like slaves. Spartacus studied the mountain the way a general studies a battlefield, tracing paths the Romans ignored, listening to the wind, feeling the slope beneath his feet. When night fell, the rebels tore vines from the mountainside, twisting them into crude ropes, turning nature itself into a weapon. Under cover of darkness, they descended the steep cliffs the Romans believed impassable, moving silently, driven by the raw clarity that comes when survival and freedom become the same goal. The attack came from behind, sudden and merciless. Roman soldiers woke to chaos, their formation shattered before it could even exist, their confidence dissolving into panic. Swords and armor changed hands in minutes, and with them changed everything. For the first time, the rebels were no longer merely escaped slaves, they were an armed force. Victory transformed them, not into conquerors, but into a symbol. Word spread faster than Roman messengers could ride. Slaves fled their masters, laborers abandoned fields, and the desperate followed the rumor of a man who had beaten Rome at its own game. Each new arrival brought strength, anger, and hunger for justice, swelling the ranks from dozens to hundreds, then thousands. Spartacus did not rule through fear or promise empires, he offered choice. Those who wished to flee Italy could leave, and some did, but many stayed, drawn by something deeper than survival. Camps formed, training began, and discipline emerged not from punishment but from shared purpose. The countryside felt the change almost immediately. Villas were stripped of excess, supply lines vanished, and Roman authority thinned wherever the rebels passed. Commanders sent against them underestimated them again and again, repeating the same fatal mistake, believing slaves could not adapt. Each clash ended the same way, with Roman banners falling and survivors fleeing in disbelief. Stories multiplied, growing larger with every telling. To the oppressed, Spartacus became a promise. To Rome, he became a question it could not easily answer. How could an empire built on order be undone by men it refused to see as human? From the slopes of Vesuvius, the rebellion spilled outward like fire carried by wind, and with every victory, the illusion of Roman invincibility burned a little more. What began as an escape had become a war, and the mountain that Rome had chosen as a prison had instead given birth to an army. By the time Rome truly understood the scale of the threat, it was already too late to pretend the rebellion was a minor disturbance. Spartacus now led an army that moved like a living force across Italy, tens of thousands strong, forged from desperation, victory, and the shared memory of chains. Roman consuls marched out with the confidence of tradition, certain that the weight of the Republic would crush what discipline alone could not. Instead, their legions shattered. Formations broke under relentless attacks, commanders fell, and survivors carried horror back to Rome's gates. For the first time in generations, senators felt fear settle into their debates, not as rumor but as reality. Markets trembled, estates emptied, and whispers filled the streets of a slave army that could march on the city itself. The roads that once symbolized Roman control now carried panic in both directions. Spartacus held the advantage of movement and belief. His men fought not for pay or glory, but because defeat meant chains, and victory meant life. Each engagement sharpened their confidence, each Roman defeat feeding a legend that grew beyond the man himself. Yet beneath the momentum lay a fault line. Spartacus did not seek Rome's destruction for its own sake. His vision was escape, a future beyond the reach of the Republic. As his army moved north, the Alps loomed as a possible path to freedom, a barrier Rome could not easily follow. But armies are not just ideas, they are people with conflicting desires. Some wanted to raid Italy, others dreamed of vengeance, and unity began to strain under the weight of success. That hesitation, that moment where Rome's heart lay exposed yet untouched, became the rebellion's turning point. The Senate responded by turning to its most ruthless instrument, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Wealthy beyond measure and driven by ambition, Crassus understood that this war would not be won through arrogance. He rebuilt discipline through terror, reviving ancient punishments to restore fear among his own soldiers. Desertion meant death, hesitation meant execution. Slowly, methodically, Roman order returned. Crassus cut off supplies, forced battles on his terms, and drove Spartacus south, away from the Alps and toward the sea. The rebels fought back with fury born of desperation. They broke through lines, ambushed camps, and inflicted losses that shocked even hardened Roman veterans. But the balance was shifting. Where Spartacus had once chosen when and where to strike, now he was reacting, pushed into narrower ground with fewer options. Attempts to escape by sea failed, alliances collapsed, and splinter groups were hunted down and destroyed. The war grew darker, bloodier, stripped of the early victories that had fueled hope. Still, Spartacus refused surrender. He moved through the ranks, sharing danger, refusing privilege, fighting alongside men who would have followed him into death. Battles became chaos, with neither side willing to yield, the land itself scarred by repeated clashes. Rome was learning how to fight this war, but every lesson came at a cost. The Republic was winning ground, yet losing certainty, because even as Spartacus was pushed back, the idea he represented could not be cornered. By the time the two forces faced each other for the final campaigns, Rome understood a terrible truth. Even if it survived, it would never again believe fully in its own invulnerability. Spartacus had already changed the Republic forever, not by conquering it, but by proving that its power could be challenged from within. The final confrontation unfolded in the rugged plains of southern Italy, a landscape transformed into a battlefield soaked with blood, sweat, and the desperate cries of men who had tasted freedom and refused to relinquish it. Spartacus stood at the forefront of his army, exhausted yet unbroken, his body scarred, his armor battered, yet his resolve sharper than ever. He had led tens of thousands of men through victories that defied imagination, victories that had humiliated the mightiest generals of Rome and shaken the Senate to its core. Now, confronted by the disciplined legions of Marcus Licinius Crassus, Spartacus faced the cruel inevitability of war. Numbers, supply, and experience weighed heavily against him. Yet even surrounded, even wounded, he did not falter. The rebels, though exhausted and poorly equipped compared to the Roman legions, fought with a ferocity that came from a place deeper than training, an unshakable desire for liberty and vengeance. Spears shattered shields, swords clashed with the roar of desperate men, and the ground itself seemed to quake beneath the chaos. Spartacus moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, cutting down enemies, rallying the tired, and protecting those around him. Every clash became a test of endurance, every maneuver a dance of life and death. For a fleeting moment, the impossible seemed possible. The Roman lines wavered under the ferocity of his charge, and whispers of the unkillable Thracian king passed from soldier to soldier, carrying fear into even the most seasoned ranks. But fate, relentless and impartial, would not grant victory. Spartacus, struck multiple times, finally fell, swallowed by the tide of battle. His body was lost among the dead. Rome would never recover it, never display it as a warning, never reclaim the man who had refused to die quietly. The army he had built scattered, crushed beneath the overwhelming force of Rome's discipline, yet the spirit he embodied refused to be extinguished. Crassus celebrated the victory with calculated cruelty, crucifying 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, lining the road to Rome with corpses to remind all of the price of defiance. Yet this brutal display could not erase what had happened. Rome had survived, but it had been changed forever. The illusion of invulnerability, the sense that the Republic could act with impunity, had been shattered by 70 men whose courage had ignited a movement that could not be entirely crushed. Stories of Spartacus, of his leadership, his strategy, and his refusal to surrender, would ripple through history, inspiring countless others to question oppression, to fight tyranny, and to seek freedom against impossible odds. His rebellion, though ultimately defeated, exposed the fragility of an empire built on fear, and the enduring truth that even the mightiest power can tremble when confronted with unwavering courage and unity. In the end, Spartacus did not die as a slave, did not die as a gladiator, and did not die as a forgotten man. He died as a symbol, an unyielding testament to the human spirit, a reminder that freedom is worth every risk, every battle, and every sacrifice, leaving a legacy that Rome could destroy in body but never in memory.